Typical phonation is called modal voice or flow voice. In modal phonation, we can look at the different parts of the glottal cycle based on the state of the glottis. The opening phase of the cycle, the glottis is expanding during about 50% of the cycle during modal voice. The closing phase of the cycle, the glottis shrinking for about 37% of the cycle in modal voice, and the glottis being completely closed, which happens for about 13% of the cycle in modal voice. Recall that the vocal folds are made up of 5 layers: the epithelium, superficial, intermediate, and deep lamina propria, and the thyrovocalis muscle. The outer 3 layers have some elasticity, the cover of the vocal folds, and the inner 2 layers are inelastic when the thyrovocalis is tensed, the body of the vocal folds. Vibration of the vocal folds occurs primarily in the cover, while the body is held in position through muscular tension, a theory of vocal fold vibration called the body cover theory, which is about how the structure vibrates, slightly different from our aerodynamic myoelastic theory, which is about the interplay between air pressure and elasticity of tissues causing vibration to happen. Because vibration of the vocal folds is caused by the air pushing through the elastic vocal fold cover, the vocal folds open and close unevenly throughout the cycle. Since air pressure is pushing up on the vocal folds from below, the opening proceeds from inferior to superior between the vocal folds. Pressure release also occurs in the same way, so closure starts at the inferior edge first and finishes at the superior edge. The vocal folds are also asymmetric when you look at them from anterior to posterior. They're connected together at the anterior commissure anteriorly, but they only come together because they're brought together by the arytenoid cartilages at the posterior end. So generally the vocal fold opening starts at the posterior end and then continues toward the anterior end. And when the vocal folds start to close, the anterior part comes together first and the posterior part comes together last. The opening and closing from inferior to superior is shown in the figure in the book on the right, where the cycle is represented from bottom to top rather than from top to bottom. So you can see in the images marked by the arrows B and E, we have the inferior part of the vocal fold being pushed apart by air pressure first, and the inferior part of the vocal fold coming together first as well, while the superior part of the vocal fold is still fairly far apart. This is also recommended in the pastel colored image taken from a different website on the left side of this slide, where the sequence of opening and closing of the vocal folds goes from 1 to 10. Again, like in slides 2 and 3, you can see the inferior parts of the vocal folds being pushed apart, whereas at 6, 7, and 8, the inferior parts of the vocal folds are coming back together again first. The opening of the posterior part of the vocal fold first and closing of the posterior part of the vocal fold last is reflected to some extent in the book drawings, slides E and F. It can also be seen in the picture of the vocal folds on the left, taken with an endoscope, where anterior is toward the bottom of the picture, so the vocal folds come together at the anterior commissure. At the top of the picture you can see the lumps for the arytenoid cartilages, and also that the posterior part of the vocal folds near the arytenoid cartilages are still open, even though the anterior part is partially closed. Modal phonation is the most effective way to use our air supply to make phonation happen. It requires a relatively low amount of subglottal pressure and effort on the part of our adducting muscles. Using modal phonation, a typical adult can phonate an ah vowel for about 15 seconds, maybe longer, depending on their vital capacity and efficiency. You can also look at the efficiency of phonation by comparing the duration of the longest S sound you can make that has no phonation in it versus the longest Z sound you can make which has phonation in it. If there's some sort of problem with the use of the voice, the Z will be shorter, but the S will not. In addition to modal phonation, other registers of the voice are either commonly used or sometimes pathological. Voice quality known as glottal fry or creaky voice, or the pulse register, is a voice quality with a relatively low pitch and a somewhat rough sounding voice with a lower fundamental frequency. This type of phonation requires a lower subglottal pressure than modal phonation, but additional muscular contraction and tension to make vocal fold vibration happen. So in this articulation, the thyrovocalis muscle in the edge of the vocal fold is left slack, so the vocal folds stay thicker and floppier, and the thyromuscularis muscle is tensed to increase pressure on the vocal folds, and the adductors are used to bring the vocal folds together. So the thick, floppy edge of the vocal fold is surrounded by tensor muscles to keep things closed. In glottal fry, the glottis is closed for most of the cycle, as compared to modal phonation, where the glottis wasn't completely closed for very much of the cycle. And also in glottal fry, there's irregular vibration of the vocal folds. If you're curious what glottal fry sounds like, you've been listening to it in all of my lectures. My habitual voice quality uses glottal fry. Falsetto or loft voice is an artificially high voice quality where the vocal folds are shortened but kept very tense, so both the thyrovocalis and thyromuscularis muscles are contracted. The cricothyroid muscle is not contracted, so the vocal fold stays short. In falsetto, there's a glottal opening only in a very small region in the center of the vocal fold, and so a very small part of the vocal fold is vibrating, resulting in a very high fundamental frequency. Falsetto is probably used the most in singing, where you can make an artificially high pitch. So a normal pitch for me might be something like ah, but I can make an ah pitch using falsetto. Pressed voice is somewhat like creaky voice, but more extreme. There's a high amount of muscular tension in pressed voice, and one of the differences between creaky and pressed voice would be there's so much tension in pressed voice that it's actually considered pathological. In pressed voice, the thyrovocalis is tensed as well. This results in a relatively loud, harsh voice quality where the vocal folds are closed through most of the cycle, but due to the amount of tension and the amount of force required to blow the vocal folds apart in pressed voice, this can be abusive and result in inflammation of the vocal folds and eventually laryngitis. Breathy voice is another common voice quality that involves incomplete adduction of the vocal folds. With breathy voice, some airflow is allowed throughout the glottal cycle, giving the voice its breathy or airy quality. Usually this is done by leaving a space open between the arytenoid cartilages by not contracting the interarytenoid muscles. This is actually the typical voice quality for a female voice. In very extreme cases of breathy voice, or if I were to try to create a very exaggerated version of a breathy voice, the vocal folds may not contact each other at all. You can also get breathiness in the voice if there is some sort of lump, a nodule, or a polyp on the vocal fold that keeps the vocal folds from coming together completely, that keeps the glottis from adducting completely. If you're interested in voice, you could spend a little time poking around on the internet. There are quite a few endoscopy videos of a variety of typical and atypical voice qualities and typical and atypical looking vocal folds available on the internet. Whispering is a voice quality that's very similar to breathy voicing, but all phonation is avoided. The vocal folds are brought close together, so part of the larynx is closed off, but again, that posterior part of the larynx between the arytenoid cartilages is left open. Enough air is pushed through the larynx in the case of a whisper to create a noisy sound source for speech production. Since the vocal folds are still coming into contact with each other in a typical whisper, whispering actually does not help rest the voice if you happen to have laryngitis. People with laryngitis are advised to not talk in any way, shape, or form, and just write notes or text or something to communicate. Here is a cartoonish image of the larynx configuration for a whisper, or for that matter for a breathier voice quality. So the vocal processes of the arytenoid cartilages have been brought together, bringing the vocal folds together, but the two arytenoid cartilages are left apart, leaving a space in the posterior part of the glottis that allows air to flow throughout the glottal cycle.